Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this session in which we're looking at a number of Baha'i communities in country areas. And you can see on this map of New South Wales a number of small towns: Mudgee, Dubbo, Bathurst, and Orange. Our session tonight focuses on the small town of Mudgee. Next week, we will look at the small town and community of Dubbo. And there are Baha'i friends in a number of other small country towns in New South Wales who we welcome to come online and share their experiences with us if there's an opportunity. I'm going to unshare that now and welcome our first speaker. So I want to welcome Paul Stevenson, who is going to speak about his parents, Joy and John Stevenson. Paul has been doing some family history for some time, and it was appropriate that we invite him to speak about his rather special family and his parents. So Paul, can we welcome you? And I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Graham, and aloha, hi everyone. Greetings to many friends that I can see on the list. It's wonderful to see you all there from Mudgee, Dubbo. You're too numerous to even mention. I'd also like to apologise for what I'm presenting tonight because we've been travelling, so I've only had access to what I've had on the computer. So you'll have to cope with that, hopefully. But I have been working on this history business of the family for about 70 years. And so there's going to be a little bit of information there that you may or may not know. The spine of it are a series of timelines, and I'll try and string some anecdotes about my parents and the early days of the Baha'i faith in Mudgee with that. So if I could share the screen, Graham?
Yes, Paul, go ahead and share.
So I've chosen as a topic here the development of two servants in the establishment of the Baha'i faith in a rural Australian community. And this is an image of Mudgee, which in probably the Wiradjuri language, it means a nest in the hills. And it's one of the last towns, New South Wales, before you enter the plains country. It's a relatively small town, but significant in some ways. So this will be about a couple, Joy and John Stevenson, and you've seen the map that Graham has shown us before. So Mudgee is halfway between Sydney and the Guabagar railway line. And don't try and say that if you're drunk. So I'd like to also string this on a series of principles and looking at history and insights. The Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana said, "Those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it." Sheikh Effendi said something different in a more positive note. He said that the Baha'is should read history so that they can be inspired. And I think that this is something worth thinking about. But also, rather than just a series of anecdotes, there is in paragraph 12 of the Universal House of Justice letter to the Baha'is of the world from the 18th of January 2019 on peace. The House of Justice says, in relation to what the Baha'i community is doing, in relation to prevalent discourses in society, these contributions articulate insights derived from Baha'i the world and aim to elevate the discussion above the acrimony and contention that so often prevent discourses of society from progressing. But I'd like to focus on this concept of articulating insights derived from Baha'u'llah's revelation as it arises during this reflection on the life of my parents and the early Baha'i community. Now, this is a timeline of the formative years of the Stevensons, and hopefully you can all see it there. It's worth noting that we're going through a particularly grey period in history at the moment with this COVID pandemic. But during the early life of my parents and the parents and grandparents of all of you probably, there were at least 4 major global the global financial crisis look a little bit like a picnic, and World War II. So in amongst that work, my father, John Campbell Stevenson, was born in Sydney, raised in Dubbo and Tumut in New South Wales. He was born in 1917 and lived in Tumut and Dubbo and Sydney until 1939. My mother, Marion Joyce Maitland, who's known as Joy, was born, raised and educated in Tumut, New South Wales. She began work as a legal secretary in Tumut in 1935 and eventually moved to Sydney. Because the Great Depression so limited everything, my grandfather had difficulty keeping a family of 4 children, and even though he was professionally a dentist, the children had to work as soon as possible. So my mother never finished school. She was very strongly committed to lifelong education, and that became one of the key features of her life. Now, my mother and father were actually in the same class for some time in Tumut, so they knew each other from childhood or the days of their youth. But in 1939, my father joined the Australian Imperial Force, the Second Australian Imperial Force, and served in Palestine, Syria, Borneo, and New Guinea. He can remember the Baha'i Gardens in Haifa as they were then, but had no direct interest in the faith. They were married in 1943. They had 5 days in which to get married, have a honeymoon, and then my father was on a train to Townsville and New Guinea. So it was a very short start to their married life. At the end of the war, and he managed to survive there. A lot of people of that era did not survive. And his survival was mainly based on a series of serious diseases that he picked up in New Guinea. So he was hospitalized for quite a while. After his return at the end of the war, he qualified as a surveyor. And in 1948, Mum and Dad moved to Mudgee, where Dad established a regional survey practice in Mudgee, and he operated up to 300 kilometres away on a daily basis, and then occasionally up to 1,000 kilometres away on a weekly basis. 1949 to 1953, the 3 children, Paul, Helen and Janet, were born. And it wasn't until 1959 that my mother began to study the Baha'i faith. And I want to look at some of the circumstances surrounding that in the next couple of slides. As a consequence of the early years, as I mentioned before, there were 4 global traumas that they had to cope with. And also remember that this time, much of it was pre-immunisation and pre-antibiotic. My mother said that in Tumut, she did not remember a single household where they had not lost at least one child. And so this was characteristic of those years at the beginning of the last century. There was also pre-refrigeration and pre-electronics. So in terms of how you ran your daily lives and how you communicated, it was quite different. Formal education was cut short. And what young people are facing at the moment when they're being locked out of school is not unusual in relation to what people had to cope with over the last 100 years. There was also a shortage of many things. And in some cases, that involved there being a shortage of men, particularly after each of the world wars. There were material limitations, and expectations have gradually been lifted until about the mid-1950s, when people started to accumulate material things. But before that, particularly as a result of the Great Depression, people felt it was luxurious to be able to eat, particularly a varied meal of some sort. So looking at the highlights of the lives of these 2 people, my mother's highlights were serving as an international counsellor. And you probably have not seen the correspondence that is received by somebody with such an appointment. And I happened to see the appointment email. This was before emails became readily used in Australia. This was in 1988, where it was really the world centre that was using emails. But in Australia, we were still furiously using faxes for everything. But her email essentially said, "You have been appointed a counsellor member of the International Teaching Centre as you have a proven ability to serve." And that was the communication. So focusing on this concept of service is one of the reasons I've chosen this theme for this particular presentation. She also served the communities of Australia and the Pacific, which she greatly enjoyed, and was committed to lifelong learning. Even when she was in her late 90s, she was still getting 12 books delivered from the town library that she would read, returning those that she wasn't interested in or she had already read. For my father, his role while serving at the Baha'i World Centre was to formally survey the holy places and properties, aligning some of them, such as the cemeteries, with the Qibla. Then he had the opportunity of conducting the Most Great Survey. In October 1992, he was requested by the Universal House of Justice to accurately locate the Qibla. Now, we all know that for obligatory prayer, we turn to this particular building in Mudgee, the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. But where was the actual centre of the Qibla? And you may not know, but this is the window which faces the west. The 3 windows facing the west, 2 windows face the north. The actual grave of Baha'u'llah is lined up against this central window in the western wall. And so the centre of that gravestone, my father asked for guidance from the House of Justice, how they wanted this survey to be done. And there were 2 engineers at the time on the House of Justice, so they clarified it to take the diagonal bisector of the gravestone of Baha'u'llah, and then to use a 1 agora piece, the 100th of a shekel, so it's about the size of the old 1-cent coin, was to be used as the order of accuracy in the centre of that gravestone. This was a wonderful privilege that my father had, and this needs to be written up properly at some stage, and I've got the documentation for that. What was the benefit of this particular survey? It means that the outer shrine, the superstructure of the shrine of Baha'u'llah, can be built from the outside without disturbing the inner shrine, because the centre is, the exact centre is known. And there are several other reasons, including accurately being able to calculate where we turn to from prayer or for prayer on a daily basis. Now, looking at the strategies that these two people used for their service, I wanted to use these two quotes. Now, one is from Gleanings, Baha'u'llah, where he says, "Every age hath its own problem and every soul its particular aspiration. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and centre your deliberation on its exigencies and requirements." And this was a particular strategy that my mother used for her service, to focus on the exigencies of the time. And I want to talk about that a little bit later. The aspiration of every soul is also something that we should all reflect on. What is the aspiration of your soul? What does it want to do? What is God calling it to do? And this second quote here, the last of the Persian hidden words, "O my servant, the best beloved of men are they that earn a livelihood by their calling and spend upon themselves and upon their kindred for the love of God, the Lord of all worlds." And I want to focus on that word calling, because it's not a word that you would translate from the Persian or the Arabic. The Arabic is iqtaraf, incorporated in this Persian hidden word, and it generally means something like your work or your profession. But Shoghi Effendi chose this word calling, and I asked my mother about this particular one. What does it mean, your calling? And she explained, and she had been a legal secretary. She said the word calling in English means that there are several professions that fall into this category. And generally these professions are the clergy, where you serve the community for almost no money, but you are serving the community spiritually. The public servants have a calling and they serve the community for a reasonable salary, but they're doing it through their administrative skills. And the third calling is for the military, who are prepared to give their life in service for the community. The interesting thing is that Shoghi Effendi chose this particular word, and each of those three categories of professions are characterized by service. And so there are many things that are folded up into Shoghi Effendi's word that he chose in English for this, that we should be reflecting on. What is your calling? And how do you determine what it is? What is the calling of our children, and how do we assist them to find that calling? So what are the aspirations of these two people? In both cases, they wanted to serve. My mother particularly wanted to teach, to guide souls. And even on her gravestone, we chose the phrase from the writings of the Bab, "It is better to guide one soul to possess all that is in heaven and on earth," which reflected what she wished for her life. She also engaged with the exigencies and the requirements of the age through the Baha'i administration. This was something she specifically chose to do. She was also interested in the building of capacity of individuals, institutions, and communities in her various roles by counselling, accompaniment, and publications. This was before we understood much about accompaniment. She was also very concerned about the equality of men and women and its achievement. And I remember we were coming home from a summer school, driving back to Mudgee, And one of the sessions at the summer school was about the equality of men and women. And she turned round from the passenger seat in the front and addressed the three of us children in the back seat. I think I was probably about 13. And she said, "And what are you going to do about the equality of men and women?" And that question has been on my mind ever since, for well over 60 years. My father chose a different set of strategies. He also wanted to serve, but he did it by being the best possible self he could, by bringing himself to account every day. And I remember he was visiting us on Norfolk Island once, and he used to get up before everyone else, and he would sit down with a cup of tea and some Vegemite on toast. And I said, why do you have tea before anything else and Vegemite on toast? And he said, "I like to have these things in front of me, and I then have an opportunity to contemplate my sins." And I think that this was his expression of saying that he was bringing himself to account every day. He also chose to teach through personal relationships and example. And he served in many ways through the organisation Legacy. He was a legatee, and at one stage, I think he had some 12 families that he was looking after on a weekly or fortnightly basis, that he would go and visit these families, counsel the children in the families, ask the widows whether they needed anything. Sometimes we would go round to the houses of these families, and it would be my job to mow the lawn while he was helping in some other way. And also he was an excellent example of equality, and I want to talk about that in a few minutes. Professionally and personally, he wanted to provide the best service possible and had very high standards professionally. Now, that was about the individuals, but what about the team? Not only did they make individual contributions, but they collaborated in many areas. In relation to children's camps at Yurrumbul, which started in 1963, and regional and deepening camps and children's camps at Mudgee, these were all joint activities. But most of all, John supported Joy in all her service obligations and on unnumbered occasions in Australia, Israel, and while travelling internationally, was her chauffeur. This was unusual for a man of his time. Looking at genealogy, and this is just a photograph of my mother and her paternal grandmother, very similar genetics there, and also our daughter Mariam and her paternal mother there, and you can see there are genetic connections there. A lot of people are interested in their material genealogy, but what is our spiritual genealogy? And this is the best I've been able to come up with so far. My parents, who became Baha'is in 1960, they learned of the faith from Jim Heggie, and Jim had a very interesting approach. My mother was a chiropractic patient of his, and he said on that occasion, "Mrs. Stevenson, I think you would be interested in the Baha'i faith." That's all it was. So when my mother got home, she ended up with pneumonia. At one stage was in hospital, and my father had taken a magazine about plywood, of all things. But this plywood magazine had an article about the Baha'i faith in it, because plywood was used for the first time in Australia for the formwork of the Baha'i temple. And there were details about the Baha'i faith there, the 12 principles. And so she was primed by this. She wanted to know more about the faith. And then at a club, a view club from memory, one of the ladies mentioned that there was a Baha'i in town. And so my mother said, "I want to see him." So this woman went to Johnny Walker, that's John Walker's father, and said, Mrs. Stevenson wants to see you. And Johnny was an insurance salesman, and he wasn't quite sure what this was about, but assumed that it was probably about buying insurance. So he went to our house in Mudgee, and my mother answered the door, and Johnny said, Mrs. Stevenson, I understand you want to buy some insurance. And she said no. And finally they sorted out what the issue was. She wanted to know about the faith. And within days she was ready to declare, but she waited for some 6 months until my father was ready. But looking at this, I understand Jim Heggie heard of the faith from Oswald Whittaker, who heard about it from Mother and Father Dunn. It's quite possible, and I need to clarify this with John, that he heard of the faith from the Boltons, who also learned of the faith from Mother and Father Dunn. But I've also been able to find there were a series of 4 American believers, and then they were taught by Ibrahim George Khairullah in the 1890s, and he heard of the faith from Abdul Karimi Tehrani in Cairo in the 1890s. So in terms of our genealogy, Abdul Karimi Tehrani was the first Persian in that line of teachers. Some of you who have heard of the faith through any of these people will then be able to see what some of their spiritual heritage is. Somewhere at home, I've got who those 4 American believers are, but I haven't got that with me. Baha'i assemblies and localities in 1954. This is a map which shows that there was a Baha'i in Gulgong, just north of Mudgee, but no Baha'is between there and Sydney other than Orange and Bathurst. At that particular time, the emphasis was on teaching and pioneering to open new localities, to establish assemblies of 9 members, to incorporate assemblies of 9 or more members, to ensure incorporated assemblies never failed, and that was to keep 12 members, and to pioneer again when the numbers reached 15. This resulted in what we used to call the Rizwan Shuffle, which meant that about mid-April, if your assembly was about to fall, there were only 8 members, there would be a call for anybody to come as quickly as possible. And so quite a few of the early Baha'is who arrived in Mudgee were to make up the 9. The first Baha'is in Mudgee were Hamlin, or Johnny Walker. He was a pioneer, and this is Johnny here. My mother, Joy Stevenson, John Stevenson, and this is John Cherry. Several of you have asked about John Cherry, and he was one of the early Baha'is in the early 1960s. This is myself and my sisters, Janet and Helen, all of us squinting against the sun outside our family home. But also there were a series of other people who declared: Gordon and Joyce Maurice, Shirley Caswell, Michael and Nada Norman Elliott, Paul Slaughter, who was an American who came to work at 2MG, and also Brian Whitehead. And I don't have the time, but he was one of these people who was part of the Rizwan Shuffle one year, and he was coming on a train from Sydney, and he missed the train connection at Lithgow and was heading off towards Broken Hill. So he would have got there before Barry Gresham did, but we had to get him within several hours because it was already the 20th of April, and my father had to drive to Parkes to get him back to Mudgee before midnight on the 21st of April. Dorothy Stoney was another early Baha'i, and she really assisted the Baha'i community in many ways for many years. I'm running out of time, but there's another timeline here of the various stages of the Baha'i life of my parents from 1960 through to when they retired in Queanbeyan. They served in Haifa for 9 years, and there are several stories here. My mother was on the NSA. She was the first woman to serve as a chair of the NSA. She loved all the colleagues that she worked with, and it was interesting that Mudgee provided at one stage 2 members of the National Spiritual Assembly, while David Bailey was also serving on that institution, this small town in the middle of New South Wales. My father served as a marriage celebrant for many years, performed 72 marriages, and was on the legal committee for many, many years. He was in the first contingent of 2 or 3 marriage celebrants from the 1960s. Now, I don't want to go into too much of what was a typical week during that period, but it was extremely full. But the one thing that we had to deal with as children was that we had quite a large kitchen, and my mother operated in there every afternoon preparing dinner. But as part of that, she would have people who were interested in the faith. So she was counselling in our kitchen. We were not allowed in there. We were sent to the living room or our bedrooms or whatever. And this went on for years, that between about 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., this was what happened in our household. And then my mother would stay up late, either with bulletin correspondence, NSA correspondence, quite often till 2 or more in the morning. She also ran a radio program for 25 years, for 5 minutes in the middle of the racing program on Saturday mornings. A typical year had all these things that we're used to, except now we have RUI sequences, but there were also these schools that were a pivotal part of many people's lives, particularly summer school. And my parents were quite often key individuals in the conduct of these schools, quite often presenting programs as well. This is David Bailey is appearing there again with my sisters and myself. It looks as though we're probably collating bulletins, which the whole community did for many years. And then there were gatherings. This looks like a Central West gathering, although there's Cynthia Brooker from Young there by the looks of it, Tony Thompson, the Duncans, and the Friedens, Baileys again, and my father and my mother there. One of the most important things my mother was involved with there was the proclamation to the Governor-General in 1985 with Stanley Bolton and Hand of the Cause Collis Featherston. This was the first of the proclamations on the promise of world peace in the world, because the Governor-General was not going to be available in the early part of 1986, the year of peace. As a member of the International Teaching Centre, this was the International Teaching Centre. 2 resident members of the International Teaching Centre were Hands of the Cause, and my mother there with Loretta King and various other members, some of whom you will know, Dr. Arbab, Isabel Sabri, Magdalene Carney. This is Peter Vuia from Africa. But you know Rihia Khanum and Dr. Furatan. In Haifa, the International Teaching Centre was in Ten Hapasim, which used to be the Western Pilgrim House, until the International Teaching Centre building on the Ark was built. This is my father showing his grandchildren a survey point in the cemetery, the Baha'i cemetery at the foot of Mount Carmel. And occasionally with visits, you got the opportunity to have dinner with some special people. In this case, this was in 1992, where our family were able to have dinner with Rihia Khanum with the Nakjabanis present. They used to have holidays in exotic locations. the Cocos Keeling Islands, Bathurst Island, off Darwin, Norfolk Island, and the wilds of Western Sydney. This is a photograph of me with my Aboriginal family and my wife's aunt on Bathurst Island. Wonderful times for them and for us there. Eventually they retired to Queanbeyan. This is a photograph of my mother with some other members of the family, my sister Janet and some of her children and grandchildren, and our daughter Sarah and one of our grandchildren. So there are 4 great-grandchildren there. So my father lived to 88 years. My mother retired at 78 and lived through to 97. And the Mudgee Baha'i community is still going after 61 years. So I think we'll leave it at that and pass over to the others. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that that really outstanding presentation and
thank you, Paul. Thank you so much.
Example for us to be able to reflect on the lives of our own family and those in our community. You've given us a wonderful starting point there. So thank you so much for that. And I'm sure there are some questions that we have for you. Look, maybe David Bailey, maybe we throw directly to you because Paul said the Mudgee community is still going and we have 3 members with us tonight. So let's invite you to share with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Graham. First, hello everybody. Thank you, Paul. I sat here shaking my head thinking my presentation is not going to be anything like that, I'm afraid. Nothing like as well prepared. It was wonderful, thank you. First of all, may I just say that I'm actually not a member of the Mudgee community. I'm in the Dubbo community, but I work in Mudgee, so I spend most of my life here. And so I'm in Mudgee tonight doing this. One of the things that Graham said when we met on Wednesday night was that he would like to hear our personal stories as well. So my personal story starts a little bit before Mudgee. So if you'll bear with me for a few minutes, I hope I won't bore you, but I'll tell you a little bit about my earlier life before I actually came to Mudgee. I was born in Sheffield in the north of England, the year that the war started, which wasn't really a very good start in life. And for the first few years of my life, I was in a city where they were dropping bombs on our houses, which really wasn't very pleasant. I was raised Church of England by my mother. My father wasn't particularly religious, but my calling myself Church of England really wasn't by conviction. It was just because that's what my mother did and I went along with it. And so I didn't really have any great attachment to that particular denomination. After I left school, my school results weren't as good as I'd expected. So my visions of going straight to university didn't materialize. And so instead I decided to join the Merchant Navy. And I became a marine engineer apprentice. And when I went away to sea, I suddenly found that there was a whole world out there that no one had ever told me about. On the ship, our crew, half of them were Muslims, half of them were Hindus. Well, not quite half, because the officers would have called themselves Christians, although whether they were or not, I'm not really sure. But I started to have these questions in my mind about, well, nobody told me about all these other things, you know, and who's right? Am I right? Are they right? Or whatever. But so it didn't really worry me. It was in the back of my mind. But in 1965, I joined a ship called the Caltex Brisbane. Now, you'll have to bear with me here. My technology wouldn't work. So I've got some pictures, but I'm just going to hold them up to the camera, and I hope you can see them all right. So can you see that all right?
Yes, thank you, David. We can see it. If you hold it still. Go
Well,
ahead.
it was only just to show that that was the oil tanker, the Caltex Brisbane that I was on. When I joined the ship, the captain and the second officer were Baha'is. I'd never heard of them before. Most people on the ship had never heard of them before. In fact, they thought they were called beehives. But we never ever really talked to them about religion. But one day, this second officer was injured. We were in particularly rough seas heading north in the Mediterranean, and he was hit by a wave and injured. And so I thought, well, I'd better go and see him and see how he is. So I went in and he was reading Baha'i material. And I can't quite remember what I said to him, but he said, he said, do you know anything about it? And I said, no. And he said, well, take this. And he gave me a little book called The Message of Baha'u'llah. Well, I took it back to my cabin and read it, and all these questions that had been going through my head were suddenly answered. We were heading for Marseille, and my wife was joining the ship there. So I waited until she came, and I showed her the book as well. The captain, incidentally, left in Marseille, so there was only the one Baha'i left on the ship. But we headed south again through the Suez Canal, and when we got opposite Jeddah, where you go on pilgrimage to Mecca, we both decided we'd sign our card. So we signed the card just off Jeddah in the Red Sea, and it was mailed to UK from Bahrain. Shortly afterwards, this second officer, Tom's wife, joined the ship as well. She was a Baha'i, so we had 4 Baha'is on this ship, and we used to feature in the British Baha'i Journal as this floating community, part of the British Baha'i community. During this trip, we went to Botany Bay, and I was able to get off the ship and visit the temple for the first time. And I remember going there, and Laurie Sherwin was guiding. She got quite upset because there was a lady who wanted to know where the Catholic bit was. She'd read that the temple was for people of all religions, and she wanted to know where the Catholic bit was. And when Laurie couldn't tell her, she stamped her foot and walked away. And Laurie turned to me as much to say, now, what are you going to ask me? And when I said I was a Baha'i, she burst into tears. So we became very good friends after that. I eventually left that ship in Sydney, but had to return to Britain. We left at the end of 1965, when they were playing the jingle about changing to decimal currency. And when we returned as migrants, decimal currency had started. So we came in the middle of 1965. We didn't know where to go particularly, but it's interesting. Paul talked about the Rizwan Shuffle. Randwick was in dire straits. They were 4 short. The Blake family had left, and the Saunders family had left. Saunders went to the Solomon Islands, and Bruce eventually was Councillor Saunders, so we knew of him. So they needed 4 people, so we decided we would move in, and the Blomley family moved in as well. They came down, I think, from Thursday. I think it was Thursday Island they were at. And so the 4 of us moved in there, and we lived in Sydney for about 2 years. During that time, I worked at Garden Island Dockyard as an engineer. I didn't appreciate the 90 minutes drive a day to and from work, but that's the kind of thing you do when you live in the city. And during that time, I was appointed to the RTC for New South Wales. One of the highlights about being in Sydney at that time was that we were able to go to Lang Road. Now, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Right. Now, many people probably won't know about 2 Lang Road at Paddington. It was the Hazrat al-Quds. It wasn't the National Office at that stage. It was the Hazrat al-Quds. And one of the resident there was Effie Baker. She lived in the flat which had previously been occupied by Mother Dunn. And so for a period of time, we had this great bounty of spending a lot of time with Effie Baker, which was, it was just wonderful, wonderful. And I had the sad but great honor of being a pallbearer at Effie's funeral. She was a very dear friend. After Effie's passing, Peter de Vogel moved in there with Kay, and he became the first full-time secretary of the National Assembly. And I think from that point, Toolang Road was classed as the national office. My first visit to Mudgee was in 1967. We get to Mudgee now at last. The Mudgee group, as it was then, Mudgee had an assembly at the end of the 10-year crusade, but unfortunately it lapsed. So the Mudgee group in 1967 had organized a grand proclamation dinner in one of the restaurants in town. The mayor, Councillor Bill Cox, was to be the guest of honor. In order to, as I say, it was only a group, so there weren't very many members, and so we decided that in order that as many as possible could attend, I would go to Mudgee and I would look after the children. So that was one of the reasons for my visit. The other reason was that I took 2 guest speakers with me, and that was Russ and Gina Garcia. Now, again, I don't know how many people know about Russ and Gina Garcia, but Russ was a Hollywood composer and musical director for movies. He worked with people like Louis Armstrong and other very well-known musical people. And Gina was an entertainer. But they decided as Baha'is they wanted to travel, so they got a trimaran, which they called the Dawnbreaker, and they sailed around the Pacific. And eventually they settled in New Zealand. They loved this area so much. But so they were here, and I took them up to Mudgee to attend this dinner. My second visit was to attend a children's camp, and I took the Blomley children to Mudgee to attend this children's camp, which this Baha'i group had organized. When we went over Cherry Tree Hill, unfortunately it snowed and we got stuck in the snow, much to my irritation, because I left England to get away from snow. And these 4 children, or 3 children from Thursday Island, were so excited about the snow. So here was me getting all upset about it, and them thinking it was the greatest thing that had ever happened. As I said before, Mudgee had an assembly at the end of the 10-year crusade, but it lapsed. But the RTC, of which I was a member, set this goal of reforming the assembly at Rizwan 1968. And so we decided that we would go to Mudgee and help fill this goal. So we sold up our home in Maroubra, or Maroubra Beach, and we packed up, and we had a 2-year-old and a small baby at the time, and we moved to Mudgee. Initially, we stayed in Paul's house, in Joy and John's caravan in their driveway, just outside the kitchen window. And we stayed there for a time until we found a place of our own. I was a marine engineer, but there weren't any ships in Mudgee, unfortunately, so I had to find something else to do. And I think anyone who pioneers has to be prepared to be flexible. So what I ended up taking some work with a small printing business, which was owned by one of the Baha'is. It was not looked upon as being a long-term thing. It was just to give me some work to do at the time. But after a while, it became clear that this business had some financial problems. And so we ended up taking over the business. I was learning as I went on the job, and I'm still learning on the job 51 years later. I'm still doing the same thing. The day that we actually took over the business was the 9th of January in 1969. It was to be a very special day. We'd taken over the business, and it was. until the phone rang. And I think it was John Stevenson, who rang me to tell me there'd been a terrible accident and our only Baha'i youth had been killed, which kind of spoiled the day. We'd never had a funeral, or there'd never been a funeral in Mudgee before, a Baha'i funeral. But John, being a surveyor, was able to contact the right people at the council, and within a few days, we were allocated a section in the Baha'i cemetery, in the Mudgee cemetery, and that is there. Can you that this beautiful Baha'i section now of the Mudgee cemetery, and so we were able to bury Ron Wood, as he was called, in a Baha'i cemetery. There are now 6 Baha'is in there, six members of the concourse who have laid their remains in that Baha'i cemetery. And when I heard I had to do this presentation tonight, I went out there and said prayers with them and asked them to help me, because it really came as a bit of a shock. The things that Mudgee was doing in those days was really quite amazing. To say it was such a small group of people. There was always activity, and the entire community was involved. Every year we would put on a display at the local agricultural show, and this was not just kind of put out a table with a few pamphlets. So one year we made, I don't know if you can see this, it's called a geodesic dome. Now, maybe it's because we had a surveyor in the community who was all into angles and things, but we actually constructed that just so that we could put on a display at the show. There were children's camps, there was study camps, there was always something going on. We had children's classes every week without fail. And one of the things that we did, we actually made a model of the temple. Which was, we made that just from a photograph. We didn't have any measurements, we just made it from a photograph. We entered competitions. There was one year where we won the trophy in the Festival of the Flags, it was called. And there was this banner which was beautifully made, and one, I think Louise was telling me what it was the philosophy and religion section of the of this competition. As Paul had said, Joy was on the National Assembly, and she also became the bulletin editor. And the bulletin was produced in Mudgee for, I think, about 6 or 7 years. Joy was the editor, and Michael Elliott and I actually worked on the production of the thing. Eventually, I was appointed co-editor as well, so that we worked on it as co-editors as well. And then when Joy became a councillor, I became the editor. So the Mudgee was the Mudgee community actually produced the bulletin. It was a total commitment of the community. Once the publication was ready, the whole community came together for the entire weekend. All we had was the machinery to print it, but nothing more. So that it was collated by hand, it was stapled by hand, it was folded by hand, it was counted out. The envelopes were produced by hand and addressed by hand. The things were inserted, they were all got ready, and it went to the mail on the Monday morning. But for the entire weekend, the community worked together. We ate together. People went home at night, but I think... Okay. In late 1977, my family, we're going on pilgrimage. And our auxiliary board member at the time was Bijan Badat, who lived in Canberra. And when he heard that we were going on pilgrimage, he said, well, why don't you make a detour and go and visit my parents? And so we had the great bounty of going for a week to Shiraz. And we stayed with the Vahdat family in Shiraz. And so we were able to visit the house of the Bab and actually sit in the room where everything began, and priceless memories. Sadly, shortly after we were there, the revolution occurred, and not long after that, Colonel Vahdat, Bijan's father, was martyred. So when that came very close to home, we'd actually stayed in this man's house, but the memories of visiting the shrine of the Bab, of course, we were probably some of the last Europeans to go, because it was not long until the revolution occurred. I was then later appointed to the National Teaching Committee, and we used to meet in Sydney at Eva Grant's house. With Eva was on the committee, Bahir Forghani, who many of you would know, Leila Kupan, and there were one or two other members, and I'm afraid my memory is starting to fail me in terms of names. In 1975, I was at the Melbourne Convention. I was elected to serve on the National Assembly. Lang Road had been sold, the 2 Lang Road property, but the facility at the temple still wasn't completed, and so for the first year we were in temporary premises at Mona Vale, rented office accommodation in Mona Vale. I had the bounty of going to the International Convention in 1978. Which was an interesting experience, and very early in the piece we realized that how laid back Australians were, because we were all given the opportunity to say what had been happening in our countries, and they did it alphabetically. So Australia came up quite early in the piece, and we all stood up and said, well, we did this and we did that and we did that and so and so, and sat down again. Well, by the time it got to I for India, the place was really jumping. The way they presented the things that they'd done was quite something. And we're sitting there saying, well, we did that. It's just that their presentation was somewhat different from ours. As I say, Joy was I've said about the bulletin. Yeah, that was. In those early days, the vast majority of printing in the Australian community was done in Mudgee. This was the temple pamphlet that was used for years. We would have produced, I don't know, there were maybe 10 or 20 different pamphlets were produced here. But that was the standard temple pamphlet for many years. There were many books produced in Mudgee, not bound books, but small compilations. There were Ray Meyer's Follower of the Light. I don't know whether you remember the book that Ray wrote. There were all sorts of compilations came from the World Centre. There were probably half a dozen different compilations that we used to print. There was a beautiful book that Peter Khan wrote about political non-involvement and obedience to government. I don't know whether these things are still available or not, but there were so many things that were produced here. Gradually, the faith grew and it grew beyond what we were able to supply. And so, but now there's very little, if anything, produced here. But for quite a number of years, this came out of the Mudgee community. I think Paul also mentioned that he said that John was on the legal department of the National Assembly, but the National Assembly legal department consisted of Joy, John, myself, and help from a local solicitor who wasn't a Baha'i, Brian Hannaford. And so that was the legal department of the National Assembly. So apart from having 2 members on the National Assembly, we had the bulletin, we had the legal department, so many things happened out of this community. In the late 70s, there was a big push to incorporate local assemblies, and the legal department at that time had to come up with all the articles and memorandum of association documents for many, many communities. And again, they were all produced in Mudgee. It was pre-computer days, so there was it wasn't a matter of just changing the name and printing out another one. Each one had to be individually prepared. So that was a lot of work from here. I was then appointed on the first board of Baha'i Publications Australia, and we went into all sorts of new fields then. One particular one was making an album. I don't know if any of you have this one, called Dreams of Tomorrow. Whether you've even seen it before. But it was a singing group which included quite a few famous names. There was where are we? Linda Safaju, who did great things with the Temple Choir. Steve Sexton, Lizzie Saunas, a gentleman called Tom Price, who again did wonderful things in the music industry. Carol Saunders and Scott Stafford. And they were this singing group who made this beautiful album, Dreams of Tomorrow. It was completely new ground for all of us. We'd never done anything like that before. We produced it at a studio at North Sydney called Tin Pan Alley, and we needed a bit of extra oomph for the music, so they brought in a studio musician who's a young man who'd never been heard of before, but his name was Tommy Emmanuel. And he probably became one of Australia's most famous guitarists. So he appears on the Baha'i. Maybe that's why he became famous, because he appeared on the Baha'i thing. By the time that Joy went on to the council, they established the Continental Office in Mudgee, the office of the Continental Board. And Betty Jackson moved to Mudgee in order to be the clerical assistant to Joy. If any of you knew Betty or not, Betty is one of our souls who now is out at the Mudgee Cemetery. But she moved to Mudgee to be the clerical assistant to Joy. So at the same time, Peter de Vogel, who'd previously been the National Secretary but had pioneered to Belgium, had now returned to Australia, and he was re-elected to the National Assembly. So once again, the Central West had two NSA members. We had Peter in Bathurst, because he settled in Bathurst. I was in Mudgee, and Joy was a councillor in Mudgee. Plus we had the Continental Office. So the Central West really played a very, very big part in administration at that time. My recollections of time on the NSA, firstly, of course, are the wonderful colleagues that you worked with. I didn't have the benefit of working with John Walker there. He was off. He'd been on the National Assembly, but he was off before I went on, and then so I didn't have the chance to work with John. But I did of course work with Joy, Peter de Vogel, Ray Meyer, Beverly Stafford, Stanley Bolton, Aflatoon Payman, dear Janet Khan, Andrew Gash, John Davidson, David Chittleborough, and so on. So serving with these people was such a bounty, such a bounty. We also had regular meetings with the hand of the course, Collis Featherston, who would consult with the National Assembly and with our councillors. Initially, it was Thelma Perks and Howard Harwood, and then it became Joy. And then when Joy went on to the International Teaching Centre, it became Peter Khan. So we had this continuous consultation with this institution. Visiting hands of the cause would meet with the National Assembly, and so we met with Ruhia Khanum on several occasions, Dr. Mahaja, Mr. Faizi, John Robarts, Dr. Giaccheri. So we're so fortunate to have known these souls, because of course none of them are alive now. One or two things that particularly stick in my mind, one actually only came to my mind a few weeks ago, and that was that we spent a lot of time trying to ensure the safety of the property that the Fitzners had built in Dili. When the Indonesian government annexed East Timor, that property was in grave danger. But only last month or the month before, we had this beautiful letter saying that we're now going to form the National Spiritual Assembly of East Timor, and that the Fitzner Center is now the institute, the center of the institute process, with many people going through the institute process. So the things that we really sweated blood over 45 years ago, it was preserved, and it was such a joy to get that letter. Another thing which particularly stuck in my mind was one meeting we'd had consultation with Hand of the Course College Featherstone and Peter Khan, Councillor Peter Khan. And it was the end of the meeting, and all the interstate members had left, and there was just Peter de Vogel and I there, and we were getting ready to drive over the mountains, him to Bathurst, me to Mudgee. And the phone rang. And do you answer a phone at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon in an office, or don't you? We kind of looked at one another, and then we thought, well, maybe we'd better answer it. So I picked up the phone, and it was Mr. Hugh Chance ringing from the House of Justice to say that the House of the Bab had been attacked, and they wished the National Assembly to do certain things. So we managed to get together those NSA members who were still around. We managed to contact Mr. Featherstone, and we managed to contact Peter Khan. They came back too. And so we extended the meeting for another 4 hours until we'd actually completed the things the House of Justice asked us to do. But it was that was quite a night. And then, of course, Peter and I had to drive over the mountains after that. So, but probably the most significant thing that I remember was in relation to the Persian community. In 1979, there was roughly about 60 Persian families in Australia. Many of us felt as though we knew most of the Persians that were in Australia. Then the revolution came, and the persecution was, I mean, there'd been persecution before, but it really became accentuated. And much PR work had been done over time, and there'd been motions in the House of Parliament that decrying the actions in Iran. But that it got to the point where something really had to be done, see if we could take some action. And so a delegation of us went to, this appeared actually in the Canberra series of talks, I think. But there was this meeting here where we went and we met with the little man in the middle there is Tony Street, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And this one here is Ian McPhee, who was the Minister for Immigration. And this delegation of Ray Meyer, Peter de Vogel, Beverly Stafford, and myself went. And we met with these two ministers on the same day, which in itself is quite miraculous that you can get two ministers to make time for you on the same day. And very, very shortly afterwards, after that, the federal government introduced a special humanitarian program, which was for people who were being persecuted for religious or political reasons. It wasn't only for Baha'is, it's for anyone who comes in that category. But it opened the doors. And so the Persian families were able to come to Australia. According to Wikipedia, by 1986, there were 538 had arrived, and by 1988, 2,500 had arrived. So the Baha'i community that we know today, largely came about because of that act of the federal government, and we played maybe a small part in it happening. So it really changed the Australian Baha'i community. I'm going very long, aren't I? I'm sorry. Am I too long?
David, we're still with you. I think.
Okay. I'm going to wind it up
time.
very shortly now. We've had a long association with the Mudgee High School. Paul will correct me if I'm wrong, but were you a school captain?
I was a vice captain.
Oh, you were vice captain. All right. So Paul was the vice captain of school. My son Colin was the captain in 2002. And as you all know, when year 12 students leave, they usually have a thing that they call muck-up day, which is a real pain to everybody in the community, but the students think it's good fun. Anyway, in Colin's year, the captains got together and they decided they wanted to do something positive. Maybe it was a Baha'i influence, I'm not sure, but they introduced the thing they called Rainbow Day. Rainbow has since had different connotations, but it wasn't at that stage. And they decided they'd do things positively. And so they took positive actions. They raised funds, which they gave to local charities. And a great time was had by all. On the same day, there was all sorts of trouble in different communities, and various principals, I understand, rang the Mudgee principal and said, how did you manage that? And it's still going 19 years later. Over the years, they must have raised close on $200,000 for local charities. And every year, the Mudgee High School's final day for year 12 students is a positive event. And I'd like to think that one of the Baha'i community helped with that. Personally, I spent a couple of years on the Orange Assembly. Then I went to, the last 9 years, I've been on the Dubbo Assembly. We bought a house in Dubbo because of my wife's work there, although, as I say, I still work in Mudgee. One of the things that Graham asked me to do, or asked us all to do, was to talk about living in the country. And so just as a final thing, I would say it's a good way of life. It's clean air, there's space, the housing is cheaper. You don't waste half your life traveling to and from work. I don't think I've ever been more than 5 minutes away from work in my life. Facilities might not be as good in the capital cities, but they're adequate. Education is good. Most of our students have excelled in their various professions. We've got lawyers, we've got doctors, we've got surgeons, we've got, I forget what Paul's, I forget what Paul's profession is, but he's excelled in it as well. So there's been no hindrance to good education for our students. One thing we found over the years, though, if people want to pioneer, it has to be unconditional. I remember years ago, Nasser Sedghi saying to me, if people start asking how good's this, how good's that, how good's so and so, he just turned to me and said, they're not going to come. Yeah, if you're going to go, you just got to go, and Baha'u'llah will look after the rest of it. And then in final conclusion, I thought I'd conclude with the words of Baha'u'llah, which is quoted in the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, where Baha'u'llah says, the country is the world of the soul, the city is the world of bodies. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that. Everybody's clapping to show their appreciation, and everybody's quite moved by your presentation. There will be time for questions after, but I'd like to invite Peter and Louise Windeyer to continue the story. So over to you, Peter.
Amazing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Peter, you just say what you were thinking.
No, I'll say that last. Yeah.
Okay. I was born in Mudgee. This sounds as if it's all about me, but it's not. I was born in Mudgee, but was living in Sydney with husband, Peter, and our three beautiful daughters, Sarah, Perdita, and Claire, when I visited my parents in Mudgee in 1981. And I was conversing with John Stevenson. Our family had had a long association with Joy and John. But actually, in the girls' version of it, Torchbearers for Legacy, with Mum. And Dad's supreme compliment to Joy was, "You should be in Parliament." He so admired her abilities. He just thought Joy was amazing. John and I talked in my parents' garden back then about the state of the world. And I said, "Oh, it's in good hands ultimately," pointing up to heaven. He said, "Oh, you should come down and talk with Joy." And so I went down an hour or so later, and we talked, and Joy lent me 2 books on the condition that I return them. And the next school holidays were the Christmas holidays, and I hastened to return to Joy and John with more questions about the faith. And Peter was observing me and the positive effect the faith was having upon me, and the negative effect my simultaneous investigations into fundamentalist Christianity were having upon me. Funny that. All my buttons were being moved by that one. He wanted to meet the Baha'is. We invited Anne and Philip Hinton round for dinner, and Peter had heaps of questions for Philip. Peter was well versed in Bible prophecies, and many questions Philip could not answer at the time, but promised to get back with the answers. This he did. So, don't be frightened of questions. You just don't have to know everything, but you get back with the answer. Peter was satisfied that Baha'u'llah fulfilled all the prophecies for the return of Christ. We declared at Nowruz 1982, and our children were 8 years, 6 years, and 5 years old. They did miss Christian Sunday school, so we started children's classes with Anne Hinton. 1 week we were at beach, and I'd fly down from South Turramurra down the road to the House of Worship to catch the 11 o'clock service with the kids. Anyway, sorry, I've digressed. I do that. So we started children's class with Anne Hinton and Barbara Collins' help. And at Rizwan, I was voted onto the Ku-ring-gai LSA. And the next week, in Peter's Studies of the Faith, because he sat down for a whole week just reading, and he said, Shoghi Effendi's instructions is that when a community reaches 15 believers, the excess should become pioneers. Where will we go? We decided to move to Mudgee. We've been trying to sell our house for months. It sold the next Saturday, but we knew it was right. So we fitted into NASA's requirements, didn't we?
Can I just mention there, we were bound to become Baha'is because I was very interested in having a look at Paul Stevenson's spiritual genealogy. And it was the connection with the Stevensons and the Springs that was the first connection. But the other connection is that Johnny Walker is my second cousin once removed. His grandfather, Hamlin Leviscount Harris, and I'm speaking, telling John Walker here how to suck eggs, but he was married to my great-grandmother's sister, Emily. So he was probably up there saying, I'm going to pin my hopes on this bloke and he's got to just come into it. So there you go.
And they all came from Tumut.
From Tumut, yes. Hamlin Leviscount Harris, you know who that, he's your great-grandfather.
Correct.
Yeah. And he's my...
my grandmother was born in Tumut, and and Joy Stevenson told me that she knew the family.
Yes. Yeah. I never met Johnny Walker here, but I wish I had, because I didn't even know the connection at that stage. But I found out since, when I started doing our own genealogy, and found out that that's where it all fitted in. Very interesting.
We camped with Mum and Dad and immediately went to the conference in Canberra in September 1982. Dr. Hugo Giaccheri was there representing the Universal House of Justice. And when he went up on the stage, everybody clapped, and he said, he got up there and he said, sit down, sit down. I'm not a great man, I'm just very tall. Oh, wow, so humble and so magnetic. That was a truly awesome moment for me, hearing him, and a marvellous event for us all. Mudgee is 3.5 hours from Sydney in the central west of New South Wales, as per the map. And it's a tourist town, and we've got a new hospital, and we've got great schools, and you can walk to work, and it's fresh air. Much of the high community was active later, and Madge Wisby, and she said a prayer. I think it's the 6th or the 8th in the prayer book. These are the earliest days of my life. And I'm looking at this 86-year-old woman, and I'm thinking, that's what it is. They're the earliest days of your life. And there she is, that dear old lady. Oh, gosh, she was a dream. And there was Alma and Michael Elliott and Frida Smith and Dorothy Stoney, and Betty Jackson came later to work for Joy, as David said. We were very quickly voted on to the Mudgee LSA, and as each of the girls, our girls, became old enough, they were on the LSA too. And Claire and Perdita held the LSA during their Newcastle uni days, as time at Newcastle was shorter than half the year. Quite early, we gained permission to start best classes for the Windeyer and Godwin children at Mudgee Public School, and then at Cudgegong Valley Public School when it opened in 1984. Several friends' children joined those classes. Over the years, classes have stopped, then resumed with other children. Gabrielle Maguire taught her daughter plus others at Mudgee Public School, and David Bailey continued that class and did several years with our Perdita's boys. We've got 2 grandsons, 16 and 14 tomorrow. And
at that school.
Yeah.
And the other grandchildren were the others.
And then I took that class with Dominic and Hamish. And Sarah had an ever-expanding class at Cudgegong Valley Public School, where she teaches, from when her Lexi started school there in 2008 for the next 9 years. I helped her in that class in the latter years and have continued there with a tiny class till COVID stopped that. I'm not quite the draw card that Mrs. Mack is, Sarah, Mrs. Mack. We had an information stand at Mudgee Small Farm Field Days, and the theme was the farmer comes first. And but this only happened once because there were objections as what's religion got to do with farming and politics, and yeah, they didn't want either of that. But we had it, and the Spidocs came from Trangie to help us. I manned an information stand at Lawson Park markets each month for years, and I think it was 10 or 15 years I did that to about 2000 and 2001. Peter was a delegate to National Convention 2 or 3 times with Colin Duncan from Dubbo, when our unit area had 2 delegates and a bigger Baha'i population. Peter was on the area teaching committee. International Year of Peace was in 1986, and with the help of Mudgee Public School and St Matthew's School, Gail Godwin and I created over 100 peace banners to go from the House of Worship down Mona Vale Road to the Pacific Ocean. That's a photo of Gail and the children and one of the community of interest, Bev, and some of the peace banners. yeah, that was a bit good. That was fun. Yeah, we did over 100 banners. It was amazing. And in that year, Gail and I gave out dozens of Promise of World Peace to business houses. Gail Godwin involved all the schools in a writing competition for children for World Environment Day. And Peter Windeyer was school captain at Mudgee Public School in 1987. And we had children, as David has said, we had children's camps in Mudgee. Yes, there's a children's camp. And held it, we used the Mudgee High School for that. I held Sunday school for Peter de Vogel's children. He'd pop over whenever he could with the children on a Sunday, and then Sunday school for Colin and Stuart Bailey, and had an early version of junior youth for Renee Reinhardt, who was David's stepdaughter, and Sarah and Perdita. That was after school, and we studied Fortress for Wellbeing. We did that weekly. And, you know, these things last for the time they last, and then they don't. Mudgee had deepening weekends at Mudgee High School, and 38 people slept at our house for one of them. And I tell you, we only had a reasonable size house, but they slept everywhere. Deepening weekends at Dubbo were awesome. They were much anticipated, and the Central West was vibrant. It really was vibrant. Mudgee held a deepening weekend at Red Hill, which is an environmental ed centre at Golgong, and we had Baha'is from all over, and I was working there then, and we wanted a herb spiral, and I said, the Baha'is will build that. So we built a herb spiral, and a really good one that goes dunk, 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 and comes back down so that the children could follow around and come on down without interrupting each other. Very nice herb spiral. And the Baha'is did that. We did a youth deepening weekend at Red Hill, and only did that once because the little treasures would wander at night, and that wasn't good. So we didn't do that again. But in Easter 1996, we held a youth camp at our house. We'd just moved into 44 Inglis Street, and Sarah did the program and games. She was at uni then. And Gail Godwin, again, and Deborah Pye and Betty Jackson and I cooked and fed the troops, all 49 of them. Some of them slept at the Godwins, but most of them slept with us. Anywhere, all over the house and out in the in tents and on the side veranda. It was, yeah, I don't know that they were comfortable, but I was. All 5 of us went to Yerrinbul summer school family camps, and Sarah and Perdita and Claire went to Yerrinbul for children and youth camps. And I can remember helping with the cooking and the washing of kids' hands. Oh, they won't wash their hands, so they had to. We did run an ad in the Mudgee Guardian with a Baha'i quote and invitation to contact us with phone numbers, but we discontinued that as the font size was halved and the cost doubled with the takeover of our local rag, and circulation is way down, so we don't do that at this stage. I was an assistant to Anne Hinton and to Mehrdad Ashman, and I was on the teaching committee twice and the BRO. Philip Hinton came to Mudgee and did Portals to Freedom in the high school auditorium, and my mother absolutely loved that. She just thought it was the most beautiful presentation because Philip really can charm, you know, and he certainly worked hard on charming my mum. In November 1997, Mudgee hosted an Australian Baha'i Studies conference at the Country Comfort Resort on the occasion of the publication of Shoghi Effendi's letters to Australasia, published as Messages to the Antipodes, and 150 Baha'is came from all over. Thank you very much, Graham, for that added information. I'd forgotten that. I didn't detail it all. Youth Year of Service. Sarah Windeyer went to India in 1992 for 7 months and Malaysia then for 2 months. Perdita Windeyer went to Maxwell School in Canada in 1994 for her year, and Claire went to Macau in China, then to Yeppoon in 1995 for her year, and Matthew Godwin went to Samoa in 95 for his year. So, you know, Mudgee did quite well. Oh, and that's Sarah.
That's Sarah coming back after India. She's on the, whichever side she is, on the outside.
She's this side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thanks, darling. And she was on, did I say Sarah was on the National Youth Committee for 2 years after her return from her youth year of service. Peter and I have held devotional meetings for twice a month for the last 11 years. We started in 2009, went to a Central West event, and I thought, we can do that. You know, it took a little while, but that was the last program that we put together. There you are, Mr. That one for the Twin Holy Days. Yeah, so we did that one. Claire teaches at Mudgee High School, and she teaches legal studies, and she always emphasises that our law is grounded in religion, much as some people like to scoff at that. She absolutely insists on them knowing that. And she teaches society and culture, and with the persecution of minority religions in Iran, she introduces a country of her interest, and then the minority persecution, and then the Baha'i faith, and her students love it. And some of them have said, this religion makes sense. You know, the young are really questioning. She's positive for humanity's future because she has encountered, she's done some high school certificate marking, and you can see where the children have a negative teacher and where they have a positive teacher. It comes out in their essays, and they deserve to be cheerful. They deserve that. Sarah and Perdita both teach at Cudgegong Valley Public School, which is South Mudgee. The teachers there would love scripture to follow the virtues program for the whole school, as it is so positive. Half of the school choose not to do scripture, which is awful. They just go to the library and do nothing, sort of thing. We're well known as Baha'is. We've studied Rui books. We've studied some in Mudgee and Central West towns, you know, done several in Dubbo, and been to Silverwater, and we've been on Skype for the later books. I've been in teaching teams around the Central West to Dubbo, Orange, Bathurst, Wellington and Mudgee. And Mudgee is now a registered group, as we have fewer than 9 Baha'is in our shire. Now, David Bailey says that he doesn't print much, but look at this. Look at that. He produced that for the 200th anniversary of the birth of Baha'u'llah. And I had, thank you, an information exhibition for 2 weeks in the town library from 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock each day for 2 weeks. And I was just going to be there for every moment, just in case somebody came. And the Catholic priest at the time, he's not here now, but he popped in 3 times to see how we were going, or how I was going. And I had over 200 visitors, which I thought was quite amazing. It was wonderful. And then David produced this. Oh, sorry, there you are, pull that apart. Produce that one, please, for the 200th anniversary of the birth of the Bard. I couldn't get the library for that one, but I had 2 weeks of art and information exhibition at the stables, which is a lot larger. So I invited 2 other painters, 2 ceramicists, and a milliner to join me in the exhibition. I was there from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock each day for the 2 weeks. The others were rostered on for 2 days each. We didn't have as many visitors as at the library. It's not as central as the library, but lots of visitors anyway. I showed it to a visitor. I showed all my preparation to a visitor that came here to home, and she was amazed at the work. She said something along the lines, "But you could have done a PhD." I was thrilled at her idea of a parallel to a PhD because I feel such an inadequate Baha'i. Oh, sorry. But just the other day, when mentioning the faith, the person to whom I was talking said, "But you live the life." I'm sure she's only seen me presenting the Virtues Award to the high school children at presentation night. But I am very enthusiastic and I bounce about and I smile. And if I really know the child that's getting the award, I give them a hug. So, you know, Claire's students comment to her that your mum's cool. So you teach in the funniest ways, don't you? The Virtues Award was instigated about 20 years ago and funded by David Bailey when his boys were at the high school. A girl and a boy in each grade receives a cheque and a certificate for being Virtues Beautiful. David still funds that award. Peter prepares our devotional meeting programs and chooses the music. He hangs my exhibition paintings, the banners, fixes the display stands, the folding tables, demolishes the exhibitions efficiently and pours the oil of calm on my anxious nerves. He also presents some of the Virtues Awards and consistently lives the life. Now, I wanted to show you something. I can't remember what it was. Oh, with the children's class, I get the hidden words and make a jigsaw puzzle for the children to put them together.
I'm not seeing it.
So I'll, nice big, you won't see much of it, but they make a jigsaw puzzle and that goes in each, and the kids have to look after it. And so we do that. And I had a folder like that for the bicentenary of the birth of Baha'u'llah, which was so that, can you do the video of that, please? And the folder was, they were able to sit down and flip through the folder of all the quotes that I had up for the birth of Baha'u'llah. Now, have a look at this. This is the library in Mudgee. What a beautiful building.
Can you see that?
Yes, thanks, Peter. So you can roll through them. Thank you.
Roll through. Yeah, there you are. There's the library.
You keep talking, yeah.
There's the library. We were in, and you'll see where we are there. We're in that nice front, looking straight out over to the coffee shops, and it's saying the displays inside. And there we are, 200th anniversary. I had that little corner only, and my table of information was across that side. And that was one of the banners that I plagiarized those gorgeous little people from a book, a Baha'i book, and extended them and made that to fill that gap, and had that one there. And then all the quotes and a few little paintings of mine. At that stage, I wanted it to only be about the Baha'i faith rather than my paintings. And that's my information table. And Lexi made those little figures. Our granddaughter, she's doing her high school certificate at the moment, and she's a great artist and designer. And there are a couple of people from our devotional meetings, Marie and Terry Kroom, and they are, diligent. They come to all our devotional meetings every month. And then,
how do I get to this birth of Baha'u'llah?
How do I get to the birth of the Bab? And we're really relaxed here.
You speak.
Oh, okay, go. Roll them, yes. I painted those frames. They're on a, I should have got the size of it, but they're quite large. Oh, here's one. I'll show you. Here's one. I'll show you right now. Can I show you that?
No, you can't.
Oh, can't I?
No.
No.
They're about 2 feet by
3 feet.
3 feet.
Each of those.
Each of these are.
And I've got the quote in the middle. And, you know, I've done those paintings with the Chris painting, and they're my little birds. And I thought, oh dear, that was a challenge, but I did them. And then some poppies with the, you know, the quotes from the Barb and quotes about Baha'u'llah, and my flannel flowers. I'm a bit pleased with those. And some more poppies, and then with the quotes, and they were all on one wall.
And that's one about the music.
Yes. And on you go, the next one, and the next one. Yeah, and go. And then that's one of my paintings. Yeah.
The theme of that one is from Waratahs to King Parrots, and it's based on the theme of from swords to plowshares. So now that's one of the
Kingdom is God's, the Lord of all names, who has come with world-embracing sovereignty.
and these were all hung in the exhibition, which we'll get to.
And now that one, the Eternal Covenant of God, is based on what Trish and Janu did years ago, but I'd lent mine to somebody else and I only had the huge one, so I redid it, but I like to put the symbols in. So I had that one, and it's when we come off the screen, I'll show you. And that's that little one that I had before. And that was in front of the table, had a big table of information for people to take or to sit and read. And that was on the table, that little one. And there's the big one that I had for the birth of Baha'u'llah and the date there. And I just, straight after the 200th anniversary of the birth of Baha'u'llah, I prepared, ready for this 2 years later exhibition. And there's Nasser from Dubbo. Nasser and Farzaneh came over to open the exhibition. Yeah, and my co-workers, my co-artists were very happy to have that Baha'i emphasis, because I had all one side of the stables and they had the other, and then the ceramics went through the middle and the hats went through the middle as well. And there's David Bailey's house of worship that he made with a children's class before we came to Mudgee. And there's my little house of worship that I made when I was at TAFE in the shape of a Waratah. And I want to see that built somewhere, a Waratah house of worship, which is so Australian. And those symbols were down the side with a quote from each of the religions. And then my paintings, mostly paintings at the end, plus that big poster at the end saying God is one, mankind is one, and all the religions are one. And somebody came in and said, bunkum.
There it is there.
Yes, there it is on the back wall. And they said, bunkum. And I said, oh, what are you saying bunkum to?
And that's Nasser and Farzaneh, and that's our daughter Claire, and that's Carol, her mother-in-law, who actually bought one of Louise's paintings, that one there with the sunflowers, wasn't it?
Yes, one of those. Yes, I did. Yeah. And in there we have our milliner. There, that girl there is the milliner, and
with the red hat on.
With the red hat. And would you believe she died? She was an attender or attendee of our devotional meetings and loved it because she was raised a Catholic and said, oh, and she just loved that. And she died just after the exhibition.
And that's Pauline. She was another artist in it.
Yes.
And Jenny over there, who was another artist, that one there with the pink coat.
And is that, you know, the other ceramicist, you know.
Yeah,
Helen. Gosh, Helen. And they had their paintings up that side and at the back. And
yeah,
anyway. it worked.
And there's David talking with Doug Moffat, who was the husband of one of the painters.
One of the ceramicists.
Ceramicist, I'm sorry. And there's David again talking with Claire. And there's Louise talking with Carol.
And it was friendly. I do look as if I standing telling her off, but I wasn't. And there's Sarah.
That's our eldest daughter, Sarah, with Fazane and Nasser, and that's Marie Kroom, who was one of our attendees at the devotional meetings.
Mm.
And that's, it goes. And they're just a few more photos of I've shown that one.
And there's
that's the other ceramicist. That's Virginia.
And Jan.
Yeah.
And isn't that lovely? Fazane and Peter.
And there we all are.
Sarah, Perdita, Claire and Carol.
And that's it.
So when you come out of that, Peter, I'll
What's happening now?
You can come back. We have.
Well, thank you, Peter and Louise.
And I want to show you what Joy gave us for our birthday once. This was Effie Baker's.
Baker's greatest name.
Wasn't it? Yes, and Joy and John gave that to us for our birthday. Aren't we? And
part of Louise's skills are that she is a calligrapher, and some of you may have already seen that. That's the I am the Son of Wisdom and the Ocean of Knowledge, and she did that on an eagle. And that's the original one of it. And she's got those on. Had David Bailey, the most great printer, he has printed cards for her and continues to print cards when she runs out of them. Thank you, David.
And I have to say that John Stevenson used to call himself the most great chauffeur. And my dad, John Stevenson, went to my dad for the legal advice, and Dad popped him across to Dad's partner, Brian Hannaford, to do that.
Thank you, everybody. That's it.
Thank you so much to Peter and Louise. It's been quite a feast, these presentations about Mudgee tonight. So we thank you so much for everything that you shared with us.
Thank you very much to all for fantastic presentation. Thank you, Graham, to arrange for that. It's such a wonderful speaker. This gentleman, I think name was David, from Sheffield in England. Is that name was David?
Yes.
David, you never know what you did. You take me back to Sheffield. I used to 15 years in England. Then you took me back to Iran. You know, Mr. Wahdat was auxiliary board member for many, many years. I was his assistant.
Huh?
Last day before executed him, I visit him in prison. Do you know what he says? He said that to me, Olia, on behalf of Wahdat, tell all Baha'i, you are like shine. My English is not good. I would somebody translate it for me, Mr. Bazavi. Shine, you are like shine, Baha'i together. Unity, come united, support each other, love, love, unity, and united. Then after that, executed him. He was amazing man, traveling all visit in Iran, all part of Iran, village, city to city. He was unique. He was really, I cannot see anyone like Mr. Wahda.
Thanks, David. Ovid here. Enjoyed the presentation very much. In fact, enjoyed the presentation from everybody. I just wanted to ask you about the 1978 International Convention. Collis Featherstone remarked in the 80s that 78 was very special. It was the last time all the hands were together. They were quite relaxed. It was just before the fate-laden revolution occurred in Iran. And people like David Chittleburrow will turn around and say 78 was very special. Just amongst the hands in general, was there any highlight for you that you could share?
Well, one thing that particularly that happened, and I'm not sure of my fact here, but the seat of the Universal House of Justice was being constructed, and Hand the Cause Rahir Khanum placed, I think it was dust from Marku, but I'm not sure. It was some holy relic that was placed above the entrance into the stonework. As I say, I don't recall exactly what it was. I tried to research it, but I couldn't find it anywhere. But that was a particular highlight, because it wasn't laying the foundation stone, but it was that kind of activity with all the NSA members gathered around. It is a long time ago now. I'm getting old. My memory isn't as good as it was, and not that it was ever very good, but as I say, I recall the enthusiasm that came from some of the Baha'i communities, some of the National Assembly members. It made us look very staid in our ways, and we weren't even the English one.
Thanks for sharing.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Ovid. Paul Stevenson.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question of John Walker, if he is still there. And I'm just wondering, John, whether you remember what year your father moved to Mudgee, and the Gulgong spot on the map from 1954, was that your father who was there? Because I understand that he was a bank manager in Gulgong at one stage. And I'd also like to ask where the Walker family became introduced to the faith.
Yes, okay, Paul. Well, yes, our family moved to Gulgong in I think 1951, and he was the bank manager for the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney, which subsequently became the National Australia Bank.
Don't hold that against him.
And I was sent to boarding school in Sydney, and along with my sister, and then he was transferred to Petersham in Sydney around about 1955, as best I can recollect, and then he then moved to Mudgee in 1958. And it would have been around about 1958, 1959 that he would have met your parents. Now, he heard of the faith from his brother, Noel, and if the Windeyers are still there, Noel's name was his initials were NPL Walker, and the L stands for Lavercourt. And my father's name was Hamlin from the Hamlin Harris name. Okay, and they were, my grandmother was born in Tumut at the, so he heard of, my father heard of the faith from his brother Noel, but Noel heard of the faith from the Boltons, Stanley and Mariette Senior. He went to them as a chiropractic patient in Martin Place in Sydney. And he was also working at the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney, but in the head office in Martin Place. So that's the background there.
Northwest has and will have still to come. I just put my question in the chat. It was a Dubbo related question, and just if anyone is in touch with the family of the late Indigenous Baha'i Lorne Highland Warburton. She was a wonderful artist, and she actually, this is probably important for the history of that area as well. She worked on a banner that went to the New York Congress, and she did a 3 metre by 3 metre painting because I did the other side of it. So we were in cahoots. And so she presented a work from Indigenous Australia at that World Congress. So I don't know whether there's anyone in touch with her family at all. And
Thanks,
I remember
Kath,
going to
and
visit her there. Yeah.
Nasser has his hand up. So Nasser, if you just unmute and show, you have to unmute Nasser.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kat. Next week, hopefully we are going to cover all those points, in particular about Lorne Highland and some of the other I'll call them my spiritual heroes in Dubbo. Therefore, wait for next week, and then we will cover that part. Thank you.
That will, thank you. David, the one last comment from you?
Yeah, just John Walker was mentioning about being in Gulgong. I don't know whether we're aware, but there was one particular edition of the Baha'i World where the Guardian's map of the localities in the world showed Gulgong. Gulgong actually appeared on the Guardian's map, and it was long before Mudgee, well, I don't know that Mudgee ever appeared on the Guardian's map, but Gulgong certainly did.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank all of our presenters tonight. Barman, you've got one last comment?
Bahide Hossein is here. She was a manager of the project, of teaching project in Gulgong. She maybe have to say a few words on that. Bahide John.
Well, I love everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. So, well, we had a wonderful project in Gulgong. I'm sure Bahman will remember more than me, but it was great. I was just thinking of those days, and David was such a great help to us and helped us to organize the project. And maybe David will remember more than me.
No, I not in terms of the organization. I think Louise would remember more of it than me, actually. But well,
I know that so many friends came and everybody contributed, and I think it was more for us to get inspired with the wonderful work of the pioneers.
Yeah.
Because we all were from Sydney, to be able to contribute in a small way to a country towns project, and we got so much out of it. And the outcome of that visit was us being inspired to come pioneering to Lismore. So that was for my family. So soon after that we came to here. So
may I just, there was one declaration from that Gulgong teaching project. What was his name now? Oh dear. this is where my memory fails me, is when I have to think about names. But there was a man from Golgong declared, and he remained a Baha'i. He died in a nursing home in Mudgee eventually. But that was the result of that teaching project.
His name was Frank, David. Frank.
Yes, Frank, that's right.
Frank, that's right.
Frank.
Yeah.
Golgong was a very famous town at one stage. In fact, it figured on the $1 note.
And $10 note, John. $10.
$10 was it? Anyway, one of them, and yeah, it was worth more than $1. And it was significant because it was the centre of the gold rush in central New South Wales. And at one stage, I think the population of Golgong was about 60,000 people.
Yeah.
And today it's probably got a population of about 1,100. But the main street looks like something out of the Wild West.
That's right.
Well, John, thank you for that. I think I can say on that note, we'll thank all our speakers for the presentations tonight. It's been a wonderful occasion. So thank you so much, and look forward to seeing everybody online next week.
Thank you. Vahid and John, we